Hello, I'm Josh Gothier from Local Writers Read, and I'm here with my co-organizer, Claire Guyton, as well as our friends Annaliese, Jakimides, and Jefferson Navicky. Local Writers Read is a Lewiston-based literary arts reading series that we started in 2018. And because of the pandemic, we have moved our series online as well as LA Arts and the Art Walk, which we are happy to participate with today. So Claire, would you like to introduce the genre spotlight for this month?
Yes, thank you. And thank you to LA Arts for the invitation to contribute to their virtual art walk with another genre spotlight. The genre we're spotlighting today is prose poetry, which is what we call poems that are written in the form of short prose, typically in one paragraph, and tell an abbreviated kind of narrative using poetic language and imagery. So Annaliese and Jefferson, who've been great friends of the Local Writers Read series, are going to show us what this form can do. But before we start the reading, I'm wondering if you two would like to tell us a little bit about what draws you to this form.
Well, sure. I write prose and poetry, almost all of it grounded in true stories, real life, often my own life. I'm really not a writer of fiction, as in short story or novels, so a prose poem feels like it feeds me, and I think I feed it, and it feels like a good fit. I love language and words that have an energy and an aliveness that is sort of at or outside the edge of something, the brokenness of a phrase. What artist Bill Irving describes as a rupture in a painting, and I love story. So it's a good fit for me. And I didn't know that for a very long time.
Thank you.
I was drawn originally to prose poetry by the visual, the look on the page, like the block of text surrounded by this big ocean of white space. And I actually can remember that the time that I first read a prose poem is Tales of Wisdom. This book was published in 1976, reissued in 1991. I picked it up in 1998, just after I graduated from college. And it was my first exposure to prose poetry, and it just blew my mind. So
Wow,
it's been in the back of my head ever since.
that's great.
And I know I'm always fascinated by the way it exists in that realm between the fiction and the prose and the poetic. And the blending of those two is always so interesting to see. So I think without further ado, Annaliese, would you like to start off our readings?
Well, sure. Thanks so very much. And by the way, thank you for inviting me to be here. I feel quite privileged. It's a great connection. I'm going to say a few words before I read the prose poem, just to kind of set it up in a way. I don't know how to impose a structure on what I write, so things just sort of show up as a surprise. Once it begins to arrive, I can see it and then I can work with it. So something might show up as a poem, it might show up as nonfiction, it might show up as a prose poem. I had recently, in this particular instance, it was a big surprise. I had recently lost my life love, and I was a bit unmoored. To try to get some mooring, as strange as this sounds, I signed up for a workshop with Claire on microfiction. Now, I didn't know Claire, and I'm not sure I had some kind of abiding desire to study microfiction at that point in time. But what I did know is that the class was next door to where I lived, and it therefore was not an impediment. It required me only to show up. And I guess I'm saying this because I think it's important for people to realize they need to show up in sometimes the most difficult of times. So this is what I wrote, and it was a finalist for the Stephen Dunn Poetry Prize. Cachekia of Time. His heart punched me, now not just the random heart strokes that everyone else is talking about or was talking about yesterday, but the infinitesimal strokes that are what I most held onto after his last breath. I cannot begin to tell you the last breath, deep gutted scent of what couldn't be eaten, He so wanted that smoothie, he asked the kitchen staff to remake in the last morning, and he would save scent of nutmeg and ginger, the bite of heartache in every breath. He lingered and scooped, his slawed fingers, the slight shred and sift of possibility. I am choking on dreams. It started that night, after I laid my left ear, the one of the 3 earrings, now only undressed holes, against the insidious pulse of his throat. Rings of piano notes throbbing up through his slack lips, cracked lips of departure, my lips sewn into his. Who would have thought he could leave that way, so much accumulated in the cycle of unfathomable gusts? So just listen, and you will begin to hear the scent of cashews and okra, blessed moments of peppermint and unguents, his skin unblemished and raw. How could I have seen all of that and known that love was expansive beyond the moment, beyond the planet, beyond the crunch of bone and unfatted fat? That is when I understood, my fingers on the deep, winded flesh of his cheek. Thank you.
Wow, now I have to follow that up. Oh my gosh. Oh, the unfatted fat and nutmeg, that's beautiful, man. Thank you, Claire and Josh, for inviting me. I'm going to read a prose poem from this book that came out a couple of years ago. It's the Book of Transparencies. Although you can call it a novel, I often think of it as a bunch of interlinked prose poems or very loosely linked prose poems. So I'm going to read one at the end of the book. And this, I'm also going to just show you, this is the thing that I most love about prose poems, this kind of lots of space in between the words, big margins. There's something about that aesthetic that I really love. So this is at the end of the book, and the narrator is talking about the process of writing a book. When I ceased to try, I welcomed the peace I so ardently yearned for, the release of the need, the biological compulsion to do. I spent the last 3 months lying happily on my back. One by one, I carefully brought forth the fragments, starting at the beginning corner, faint images I didn't even know I still possessed, and moved forward. The book slowly assembled itself in my mind, paragraph by paragraph, page by page. Names and numbers melted into maps and diagrams. Border disputes and cinematic operations merged with quixotic episodes when I found myself writing in a language I was unable to read, or onto a page that remained perpetually blank. I smiled. The book filled my head. Some bits were missing. Some I found and some I let go. My head became too small to contain the contents. The book spilled out of my head and filled the entire barn. Still, some bits were unaccounted for. I looked for them, and some of them I found, a few. The book passed through the cedar, out through the hayloft door, and permeated the surrounding hills, their separate curves becoming united with my circular mind. The book unfolded like a thin film and melded with the trees, some of them. With others, the book became the trees and birds and sky. By now, I'd already died. Death by drowning, the doctor pronounced. The procession began. No one noticed it was autumn. I now forget the time on the clock, but it feels less chronological and more of a prayer. Last night, in my sleep, I saw a paragraph like an island on a white sea.
Just love the perfect final lines of both of those pieces. I also love the fact that they have very different feelings at the same time that they accomplish very much the same thing. Just very distinct voices, both of you. Thank you so much for that. Before we go, this is your chance to recommend to people a favorite prose poem or a poet who writes beautiful prose poems?
Well, okay. I'm going to give you two names, and they're as different and as similar as they could probably be. Margaret Atwood, who is primarily known as a novelist of like Handmaid's Tale and Alias Grace, and is 80 years old, writes fabulous prose poems, and was a poet before she was a prose writer. So I'd say look for Margaret Atwood. And then the other one is Dennis Smith, who is 30 years old, and his Don't Call Us Dead was a finalist for the 2017 National Book Award. And I love them both. They are very different, and yet they are both very structured into reality, the political world, the dynamics that are going on that feed us and move us.
I would recommend, well, I love Sabrina Ora Mark, who writes both short stories and prose poems. And I think some of the best prose poems that I have read. And then also lots of people from this book, which is, it's old, but it's got a lot of good prose poems from Kafka, Borges, and then a whole bunch of people that I had never heard of, but now have heard of. So I think those are my recommendations.
What's the title? I'm sorry.
Tales of Wisdom.
Tales of Wisdom. Okay. Thanks. That's great. Thank you.
Yes. So yeah, thank you, Annaliese and Jefferson, both for reading with us today. Your work, as always, is lovely and a delight to hear. And we want to also say thank you again to LA Arts for letting us participate in another digital art walk. And thank you to everyone who is tuning in to this event for taking the time to watch and listen and join with us as we continue to celebrate the arts, even though things are not quite what we would like them to be at the time. So thank you all for listening, and tune in next month for another genre spotlight from Local Writers Read. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.